In the quiet folds of time, before time was counted or measured, it was said that there existed chaos. This chaos was not disorder in the later sense, but rather a vast and undefined emptiness, a yawning openness in which nothing yet had a fixed place. One finds that this chaos was simply there, without origin, without intention, and without urgency. From chaos, slowly and without announcement, other presences came into being. These presences did not arrive suddenly. They appeared as conditions rather than personalities, as states of existence rather than figures with will. From chaos came Gaia, the broad-breasted earth, who was said to be solid and enduring. Gaia existed as the ground beneath all later things, though at the time there was nothing yet to stand upon her. Alongside Gaia came Tartarus, deep and remote, existing far below what would later be called the earth, though the distinction between above and below had not yet fully formed. Eros also emerged, described as a force of attraction and connection, not yet the playful god of later ages, but a principle through which beings might come together. Erebus came as darkness, and Nyx as night, and these two simply were, without ceremony. It was said, and then said again, that from Erebus and Nyx came Aether and Hemera, the upper air and the day. This was mentioned in passing by later poets, who repeated it as it had been repeated before them. In this manner, the world accumulated its components gradually, with no single moment of creation, only a slow layering of existence. As the ages turned slowly, Gaia, who had come from chaos and who remained constant, brought forth other beings from herself. Without union, Gaia produced Uranus, the sky, who covered her completely. Uranus was said to stretch in all directions, enclosing Gaia, and together they formed a complete structure, earth below and sky above. Gaia also produced the mountains, which rose without effort, and Pontus, the sea, which spread quietly along her surface. These things happened as part of the natural course of events, without conflict and without celebration. Gaia and Uranus, earth and sky, then came together, and from them were born the first generation of Titans. There were 12 of them, and their names were repeated often in the traditions. Oceanus was born, who encircled the world as a great river. Coes followed, then Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Cronus, who was the youngest. Alongside them were born the Titanesses, Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. These names were preserved carefully, listed again and again in genealogies, because genealogy mattered greatly in later ages. It was said that Uranus did not favor all of his children. From Gaia he also fathered the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires, beings of great strength and unusual form. The Cyclopes had a single eye, and the Hecatonchires had many hands. Uranus, finding them displeasing, hid them away within Gaia, pressing them back into the earth. This caused Gaia discomfort, which was described plainly and without embellishment. She endured it for some time, as the earth endures pressure, but eventually she sought relief. Gaia fashioned a sickle of hard stone. She asked her Titan sons to act. One finds that most of them did not respond. They remained as they were, neither agreeing nor refusing. Cronus, however, who was the youngest Titan and who had been born of Uranus and Gaia, agreed to act. This is stated simply in the sources. When Uranus came again to cover Gaia, Cronus struck him with the sickle. The act was decisive, and its consequences unfolded slowly. Uranus was separated from Gaia, and his blood fell upon the earth. From this blood came the Furies, the Giants, and the Melii. These details were noted carefully by later writers. From the severed parts cast into the sea, foam arose, and from that foam Aphrodite would later emerge, though at this stage she had not yet appeared. Uranus withdrew, and the rule of the cosmos passed to the Titans. Cronus, son of Uranus, who himself was born from Gaia, became the ruler. He took his sister Rhea as his consort. This was not considered unusual, as kinship among the gods followed different expectations. Under Cronus, the Titans governed. Oceanus continued his endless flow. Hyperion fathered Helios, Selene, and Eos, who brought the sun, the moon, and the dawn. Mnemosyne preserved memory. Themis embodied order. These functions were described in calm, methodical terms. It was said, and then said again, that Uranus, before withdrawing completely, warned Cronus that he too would be overthrown by his own child. This warning was remembered and repeated. Cronus, hearing it, acted as he did because it seemed prudent. Each time Rhea bore a child, Cronus swallowed the child whole. Hestia was swallowed. Demeter was swallowed. Hera was swallowed. Hades was swallowed. Poseidon was swallowed. These events occurred one after another, without variation. Rhea, distressed in a quiet and enduring way, sought counsel from Gaia. When Zeus was born, Rhea wrapped a stone in swaddling cloths and gave it to Cronus, who swallowed it, believing it to be the child. Zeus was hidden away, raised apart from his father. This fact was repeated in several traditions, though the location varied. What remained constant was that Zeus grew, slowly and without haste, as the ages continued their steady turning. Zeus, having been hidden and raised apart, grew in the quiet manner in which divine beings were said to grow. He was nourished, it was said, by milk and honey, though the exact details varied slightly and were repeated in similar ways. In the course of events, Zeus came to full strength. He learned of his origin, and he learned of the fate of his siblings who remained within Cronus. This knowledge settled into him without urgency. Action followed knowledge in due time. With the counsel of Gaia, and sometimes with the quiet assistance of Metis, Zeus prepared a potion. It was given to Cronus, who drank it without suspicion. one finds that what followed occurred as it was meant to occur. Cronus vomited forth the children he had swallowed, one after another, in the same order in which they had been taken in. Hestia emerged, then Demeter, then Hera, then Hades, then Poseidon. Zeus stood among them as they took their places. These events were not hurried. The conflict that followed was known as the Titanomachy. It lasted for 10 years, which was stated plainly in the accounts. The Titans, led by Cronus, held Mount Othrys. The Olympians, led by Zeus, held Mount Olympus. The battles were described as vast, though they unfolded slowly across time. Thunder was thrown, stones were hurled, the earth shook in ways that were noted but not dramatized. Neither side gained advantage quickly. Eventually, Zeus freed the Cyclopes and the Hecatonchires from Tartarus. This act was recorded as a turning point, though it was described without excitement. The Cyclopes forged weapons. They gave Zeus the thunderbolt, Poseidon the trident, and Hades the helm of invisibility. The Hecatonchires hurled stones in great number. The Titans were overcome. One after another they fell back. Cronus was defeated as Uranus had said he would be. The Titans were cast into Tartarus, guarded by the Hecatonchires. Some Titans, such as Oceanus, remained apart and were not punished. These distinctions were preserved carefully. Zeus and his siblings divided the cosmos. Zeus took the sky, Poseidon took the sea, Hades took the underworld. The earth remained common ground. This division was accepted as final and orderly. After the war, another challenge arose in the form of Typhon, born of Gaia. Typhon was vast and destructive, though this too was conveyed in restrained terms. Zeus faced Typhon. Thunder was used. Mountains were thrown. Eventually, Typhon was subdued and buried beneath the earth. With this, the rule of the Olympians was secured. Order was said to have been established. Zeus then took his place as king. Hera became his consort. This union was formal and enduring, though it was also the source of many later complications. Athena was born from Zeus's head, fully formed, after he swallowed Metis. Apollo and Artemis were born of Leto. Aphrodite arose from the sea foam, as had been foretold earlier. Hermes was born of Maia. Ares was born of Zeus and Hera. Hephaestus was born, according to some, of Hera alone. Dionysus was born later, of Semele, and was brought to term within Zeus himself. These births were listed and relisted. Each god took on domains. Zeus ruled with thunder and law. Hera presided over marriage. Poseidon stirred the seas. Hades governed the dead. Athena oversaw wisdom and craft. Apollo guided prophecy and music. Artemis tended the wild. Aphrodite embodied attraction. Hermes carried messages. Ares governed war. Hephaestus forged. Dionysus brought wine. These functions were stable and repetitive. Zeus's many unions were recorded in detail. From them came gods and heroes. Hera's responses followed a familiar pattern. Io wandered. Semele perished. Callisto was changed. These events occurred as they always seemed to occur. Apollo established his oracle at Delphi after defeating Python. The oracle spoke in riddles, which were interpreted slowly. Prometheus, a Titan who sided with Zeus, shaped humans from clay.
He gave them fire, taken from Olympus. Zeus punished him by binding him to a rock where an eagle consumed his liver daily. This punishment repeated endlessly. Pandora was created and sent to humans. She opened a jar. Troubles emerged. Hope remained. This was stated without emphasis. Heroes arose. Perseus slew Medusa with assistance and method. Heracles performed 12 labors, one after another, each described plainly: the lion, the hydra, the boar, the stables, and so on. These tasks took years. Theseus traveled to Crete and killed the Minotaur. Jason sailed with the Argonauts and sought the Golden Fleece. Medea assisted him, as was recorded. The Trojan War occurred after long causes. Paris judged the goddesses. Helen went to Troy. Armies gathered. Achilles fought. Hector defended. Patroclus fell. Achilles returned to battle. Troy was taken by a wooden horse. These events filled many verses and were retold often. Odysseus wandered for 10 years afterwards. He encountered monsters, storms, and delays. Eventually, he returned home. The underworld remained constant. Souls passed through. Persephone divided her time between above and below. Demeter mourned and rejoiced in cycles. Orpheus descended and returned alone. Monsters appeared and were slain. The chimera fell. The hydra was burned. These stories accumulated. As the ages turned slowly, heroes faded. The gods withdrew. Mortals continued. One finds that the myths did not end suddenly. They receded gradually. And thus the myths recede into the mists of forgotten yesteryears, where they remain, unchanged, repeated, and quietly enduring, as time continues without noticing them.
After these matters had been set down, it was also said, and then said again in other tellings, that the ordering of the Olympian world did not bring stillness, but rather a long continuation of small events, repeated patterns, and familiar outcomes. The gods remained active, though their actions followed recognizable forms. Zeus continued to rule from Olympus, seated among clouds that gathered and dispersed in a regular manner. Thunder was held in reserve and released when required. Law was spoken and reaffirmed. Oaths were sworn, and when broken, were addressed in due course. Hera, as queen, maintained her role with persistence. Marriage rites were observed under her watch. Jealousy arose, not suddenly, but as a recurring condition. Each affair of Zeus followed a similar progression. A mortal or nymph was noticed. Transformation followed. A child was born. Hera responded. The response involved pursuit, punishment, or alteration. Io wandered as a cow across long distances. Leto endured prolonged labor. Semele was consumed by divine radiance. These events were noted as part of the established order. Athena continued to act as advisor and protector. Cities were founded and named. Athens itself was claimed through a contest with Poseidon, who struck the earth and produced salt water, while Athena produced the olive tree. The judgment favored usefulness and longevity. Athena's assistance to heroes followed a consistent pattern. She guided hands, steadied minds, and then withdrew. No lingering presence was required. Apollo traveled widely. At Delphi, his oracle continued to speak. Questions were asked. Answers were given in indirect language. Priests interpreted them carefully. Music accompanied rituals. Plagues were sent and later withdrawn. Artemis remained apart, hunting in forests that were described again and again as untouched. Those who crossed her boundaries were punished, often through transformation or death, carried out without excess description. Aphrodite influenced unions. Attraction occurred where it had not existed before. Consequences followed. Ares engaged in conflict. Battles were fought with familiar outcomes. Hephaestus worked at his forge, crafting objects that endured. Nets, armor, and automatons were produced methodically. Dionysus traveled among mortals, spreading wine and altered states. Resistance was met with madness. Acceptance led to ritual. Hermes moved between realms. Messages were delivered. Boundaries were crossed. Commerce and travel proceeded. Hades ruled the underworld with consistency. Judgment followed death. Rewards and punishments were assigned. Rivers flowed. Cerberus remained at the gate. Among mortals, the heroic age continued for a time. Heracles completed his labors and later met his end, ascending to Olympus. Perseus ruled and aged. Theseus became king and eventually faded from prominence. Jason returned and declined. The descendants of heroes lived ordinary lives. Lineages were traced carefully by poets and chroniclers. The Trojan War's aftermath unfolded gradually. Cities were rebuilt. Survivors returned home or failed to do so. Agamemnon was killed. Orestes avenged. Cycles of vengeance continued until resolved through new institutions. These developments were seen as transitions rather than conclusions. As the quiet folds of time continued to close, divine intervention became less frequent. The gods remained, but their presence was felt more in ritual than in appearance. Sacrifices were offered. Festivals were observed annually. Stories were told in the same words they had been told before. One finds that the age of heroes did not end abruptly. It thinned. Deeds became smaller. Names became less widely known. Mortals lived and died without divine parentage. The gods observed from a distance. The world settled into repetition. And so, as the ages turned slowly and without announcement, the myths remained as they were, unchanged in their telling, preserved in memory and verse. In this manner, the narrative continued without urgency, until it no longer needed to be continued, and rested quietly among the things remembered from long ago.
As time extended further, it was also recorded
that the boundaries between the divine and the mortal became more clearly defined. The gods remained immortal, unchanged by age, while mortals continued to age, to labor, and to die. This distinction was restated often, as it explained much of what followed. The gods were worshipped through established customs. Altars were built of stone. Animals were sacrificed according to local tradition. Smoke rose upward, and it was said that the gods received it, though no visible response was expected. Genealogies continued to be traced. Kings claimed descent from gods or heroes, sometimes from Zeus, sometimes from Poseidon, sometimes from Apollo. These claims were repeated carefully, generation after generation, even when the deeds attached to the names became smaller. The heroic blood was said to thin, though it never vanished entirely. Local myths arose to explain springs, hills, and ruins. Nymphs were assigned to streams. Spirits were attached to groves. Each place had its story, and each story followed familiar patterns. The monsters that remained were fewer. Some were said to sleep. Others had been destroyed in earlier times. Typhon lay buried. The Hydra was gone. The Chimera was remembered, but not seen. What dangers remained were ordinary ones: storms, illness, and conflict among mortals. These were no longer framed as direct acts of the gods, but as parts of life. In the underworld, the processes continued unchanged. Hermes guided souls. Charon ferried them across the river. Judges listened. Fields received the worthy. Shadows gathered quietly. Persephone continued her cycle, descending and returning. Demeter's grief and relief followed the seasons. Crops grew and failed. This rhythm was described again and again, as it was considered important to understanding the world. Poets preserved the myths by repeating them. They did not alter them greatly. Variations were noted, but the structure remained. Teachers recited them. Children learned the names of gods and heroes. The stories were not questioned closely. They were accepted as inherited knowledge. Over time, new generations focused more on law, philosophy, and record-keeping. The gods remained present as concepts and symbols. Zeus represented order. Athena represented wisdom. Apollo represented reason. These associations were restated calmly. Temples stood as reminders. Festivals marked the calendar. And thus, without a final event or decisive ending, the age shaped by gods and heroes gave way to the age of ordinary memory. The myths did not disappear. They settled into permanence, unchanged, neither growing nor diminishing. They existed as they always had, ready to be told again, in the same words, at the same pace, whenever time allowed.
In the continued passage of time, which was not marked by divine proclamation or sudden alteration, it was observed that the stories themselves became the primary presence of the gods. Where once Zeus had been said to appear in person, Now he appeared mostly in recollection. Where Athena had once stood beside heroes, now she stood beside ideas. This shift was not described as a loss, but as a gradual adjustment, unfolding without resistance. Rituals persisted. The same words were spoken at sacrifices. The same gestures were made. Libations were poured in measured amounts. Hymns were sung in familiar meters. Each repetition resembled the last. This repetition was considered proper, as deviation was unnecessary. The gods were thought to prefer consistency. Local traditions multiplied quietly. In one place, a hill was said to mark the resting spot of a god. In another, a stone was said to have been thrown by a hero long ago. These claims were neither proven nor disputed. They were simply repeated. Travelers heard them and passed them along. Over time, the telling became more important than the event. The heroic age, when examined closely, was said to have ended not with a final hero, but with the absence of new ones. No new labors were assigned. No new quests were announced. Mortals continued to struggle, but their struggles were private and limited. They were not elevated to mythic scale. This distinction was subtle but enduring. Zeus continued to be named in oaths. Hera continued to be invoked in marriage. Poseidon continued to be blamed for storms. Hades was mentioned quietly and rarely. Athena was consulted through study rather than prayer. Apollo's oracle spoke less often and eventually fell silent, though this was not treated as an event. It was treated as a condition that developed over time. The genealogies reached their practical limit. Names became harder to connect. The divine ancestor was increasingly distant. The record remained, but its relevance diminished. Scribes copied older texts rather than adding new ones. Commentaries replaced narratives. Analysis replaced recitation. In the quiet folds of time, the myths settled into a fixed form. They were no longer unfolding. They were being preserved. This preservation was careful and deliberate. Variants were compared. Lines were memorized. Nothing new was required. And so it was said, in the manner of those who looked back rather than forward, that the world had passed from the age of gods and heroes into the age of remembrance. The gods remained immortal. The stories remained intact. Mortals continued their lives beneath the same sky and upon the same earth that Gaia had been since the beginning. There was no final word spoken by Zeus, no closing act by Hera, no last oracle from Apollo. There was only continuation, quiet and unremarkable. The myths endured as they always had, resting in language, waiting to be repeated again, slowly, without urgency, as the ages continued to turn.
As the long continuity extended further, it was also remarked by later writers that the persistence of the myths depended less on belief and more on habit. People continued to tell the stories because they had always been told. The order of events was known. Chaos came first. Gaia followed. Uranus ruled and fell. Cronus ruled and fell. Zeus ruled and remained. This sequence was recited without alteration, as stability was valued. Seasonal festivals returned each year. The same days were marked. The same offerings were prepared. Grain was dedicated to Demeter. Wine was poured for Dionysus. Animals were sacrificed to Zeus and Hera. The acts themselves did not change meaningfully. They were performed because they had been performed before. This repetition created a sense of continuity that required no explanation. The landscape remained, and it continued to be described in mythic terms. Mountains were still said to have been shaped by giants or gods. Rivers were still associated with ancient deities. The sea was still attributed to Poseidon's temperament, even when sailors understood winds and currents more precisely. The old explanations remained alongside the new ones, without conflict. Education preserved the names. Students learned the Olympians in order. They learned the Titans in order. They learned the heroes in lists. Perseus came before Heracles. Heracles came before Theseus. Theseus came before the warriors of Troy. This ordering was accepted and repeated, even when details blurred. The underworld retained its structure. Though fewer stories were told of descents and returns, the rivers were still named. Styx remained the river of oaths. Lethe remained the river of forgetting. Judges still sat in their assigned places. These details were not revised, as they were already sufficient. As the ages turned slowly, the distinction between story and history became clearer, though it was not sharply drawn. Some listeners treated the myths as literal accounts. Others treated them as symbolic. This difference did not disrupt the telling. The words remained the same, regardless of interpretation. One finds that even silence became part of the tradition. Gaps in the record were acknowledged, but not filled. What Zeus did not do was as accepted as what he did. What was not known was left unknown. There was no expectation that everything required explanation. And so, in the continued unfolding of ordinary time, the myths of Greek antiquity remained present without action. They neither advanced nor retreated. They existed as a complete cycle, beginning with chaos and settling into memory. The gods did not depart. They simply ceased to intervene. Thus, without conclusion or finality, the narrative rested. It remained available, unchanged, for repetition, and thus the myths recede into the mists of forgotten yesteryears, not lost, but quiet, preserved in language, as time continues on its unremarkable course. As the long remembrance continued, It was further noted that the gods, though unchanged in themselves, became increasingly fixed in representation. Zeus was carved with a beard and seated posture. Athena was shown with helmet and shield. Apollo held the lyre. These images were repeated in stone and paint, again and again, until variation was unnecessary. The forms became standard, and the standard endured. Stories were copied from older sources. Hesiod was cited. Homer was cited. Later writers referred back to them rather than forward. The acts of the gods were no longer added to, they were catalogued. Commentators explained relationships, clarified names, and reconciled contradictions. This work proceeded slowly and carefully, without urgency. Philosophers spoke of the gods in abstract terms. Zeus became order, Hera became continuity, Poseidon became instability, Hades became inevitability. These interpretations did not replace the older stories. They existed alongside them. The myths remained intact, unaffected by reinterpretation. In households, simple practices continued. Small offerings were left at doorways. Brief prayers were spoken before travel. These actions were habitual rather than expectant. No response was required. The gods were acknowledged, and life proceeded. The heroic narratives were still recited, though often without embellishment. Heracles labored. Achilles fought. Odysseus wandered. These sequences were familiar enough that listeners knew what came next. There was no suspense. The outcome was known. This predictability was considered appropriate. Monsters remained in memory only. The names were listed: Gorgon, Hydra, Chimera, Sphinx. Each was associated with a hero and a resolution. No new monsters were required. The world was sufficiently ordered. In the underworld, nothing changed. The same rivers flowed. The same divisions remained. The dead arrived steadily. There were no disruptions. Even the punishments of Sisyphus and Tantalus continued without variation, serving as reminders rather than active warnings. As the ages turned slowly and without notice, fewer people claimed direct interaction with gods. Dreams replaced visions. Omens replaced appearances. Eventually, even these became rare. This was not recorded as a loss, but as a settling. Thus, the mythic time concluded, not with silence, but with stability. Everything that needed to happen had happened. Everything that needed to be said had been said. What remained was repetition. And so the narrative rests, complete in itself, beginning with chaos and ending with memory. The gods remain where they have always been. The stories remain as they have always been, and time continues, quietly, without requiring anything further. As the slow continuation persisted, it was also observed that the act of remembering became more significant than the events remembered. The myths were no longer experienced as accounts of action, but as established references. When a storm arose, Poseidon was mentioned. When wisdom was sought, Athena was named. These references required no elaboration. The meaning was understood through familiarity. The passage of time did not alter the sequence. Chaos remained first. Gaia remained enduring. Uranus remained overthrown. Cronus remained defeated. Zeus remained in place. This order was fixed and unchallenged. Even when recited imperfectly, the structure held. Errors were corrected gently, without concern. The minor gods and spirits continued to exist in lists and marginal notes. Dryads inhabited trees. Naiads inhabited springs. Household gods guarded entrances. These presences were small and local, and they did not intrude. They were acknowledged briefly and then left alone. In accounts of the past, the heroic age was sometimes divided into generations. Early heroes were said to be closer to the gods. Later heroes were said to be more mortal. This distinction was stated plainly and accepted. No explanation was required beyond repetition. The Trojan War remained the final large gathering of heroes. Everything after it was smaller. This was noted repeatedly. The world was described as less receptive to greatness. The gods did not contradict this assessment. They remained silent. Temples aged, stones weathered, repairs were made. New temples resembled old ones. The architectural forms repeated as faithfully as the stories. Columns rose in the same proportions. Statues followed the same models. Innovation was limited and gradual. The underworld continued its quiet function. Names were recorded. Lives ended. Souls passed on. There were no interruptions. Even the rare descents of heroes belonged firmly to the past. No new songs were added. In time, the myths became part of education rather than worship alone. They were studied. They were compared. They were organized. This organization did not diminish them. It stabilized them further. A stable thing does not change. Thus, in the ongoing calm of unremarkable ages, the mythic narrative remained complete. Nothing was missing. Nothing required addition. The stories existed as they always had, neither advancing nor retreating. And so, as the quiet folds of time continued to close in upon themselves, the myths remained where they had settled long ago. They were neither alive nor dead, but preserved. They waited patiently, unchanged, ready to be spoken again in the same slow manner, whenever the need for repetition returned. As the continuation extended still further, it was understood that nothing new was required for the narrative to persist. The persistence itself was sufficient. The myths did not demand renewal. They remained complete, whole, and adequate in their existing form. Each retelling reaffirmed this completeness, even when nothing was added. The gods, as they were known, did not change their roles. Zeus continued to be the reference for authority. Hera continued to represent continuity within households. Poseidon remained associated with the sea, regardless of changing knowledge of navigation. Athena remained linked to learning. These associations were stable and did not require reinforcement beyond mention. In quiet places, individuals still spoke the old names. They did so without expectation of response. The names themselves were the point. Speaking them acknowledged continuity. Silence followed, and this silence was acceptable. Written records accumulated slowly. Copies were made of copies. Marginal notes were added and later ignored. The original stories remained intact beneath layers of commentary. Scholars disagreed mildly and recorded those disagreements carefully. No resolution was necessary. The monsters, having long since been confined to memory, served primarily as examples. They illustrated boundaries. They represented excess. Their defeats illustrated order. This explanatory role was sufficient. No further appearances were expected. The heroic age, once examined repeatedly, settled into a defined span. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. This definition was repeated in teaching. Students learned it. They moved on. Nothing replaced the myths. They were not displaced. They simply ceased to grow. Growth was no longer part of their nature. Preservation was. Thus, as time continued in its ordinary manner, the myths remained exactly as they had been left. They did not call to attention themselves. They rested quietly in language, in memory, and in routine reference. And so, without conclusion and without disruption, the narrative continues by remaining the same. The world moves on, the stories remain, and in this stillness they endure, unchanged, unhurried, and complete. As the unbroken span of ordinary years continued, it was acknowledged by those who recorded such things that the myths required no further elaboration in order to remain present. Their presence was maintained through repetition alone. Each retelling resembled the last. Any variation was minor and corrected over time, returning the story to its established form. The gods, fixed in name and function, did not acquire new attributes. Zeus remained associated with the sky and authority. Hera remained associated with marriage and endurance. Poseidon remained associated with the sea and instability. Hades remained associated with the dead and the unseen. Athena remained associated with wisdom and measured action. Apollo remained associated with light, order, and prophecy. Artemis remained associated with wilderness and restraint. Aphrodite remained associated with attraction and consequence. Hermes remained associated with movement and exchange.
Ares remained associated with conflict. Hephaestus remained associated with craft. Dionysus remained associated with altered states and ritual release. These associations were recited in lists and remembered without effort. The myths no longer unfolded as narratives of action, but as frameworks. When a question arose, a story was referenced. When an explanation was needed, a myth was cited. This use did not alter the myth, it reaffirmed it. The same examples were used repeatedly because they were sufficient. In the underworld, nothing changed. The same paths were followed. The same outcomes occurred. Memory faded where it was meant to fade. Identity dissolved where it was meant to dissolve. The order was consistent and required no intervention. In the world above, the seasons continued to turn. Demeter's cycle remained the explanation, even when other explanations were known. The coexistence of explanations was not considered a problem. The myth explained meaning. Other explanations explained mechanism. Both were accepted. The heroic age, long past, remained intact as a closed chapter. No additions were made, no revisions were required. It was referenced as a whole, rather than as a sequence of events. Achilles was remembered as Achilles. Heracles was remembered as Heracles. Odysseus was remembered as Odysseus. Their individual actions mattered less than their established identities. Thus, the narrative reached a state in which continuation meant repetition, and repetition meant preservation. Nothing progressed, nothing declined. The myths existed in equilibrium. And so, in the quiet folds of time, with no urgency and no expectation of change, the stories remained exactly where they had settled. They neither advanced nor concluded. They simply endured, as they had always endured, receding gently into the mists of forgotten yesteryears, where they remain, unchanged, waiting patiently to be spoken again, slowly, calmly, and without end.
Zeus ruled. This was the established fact. The world beneath him was ordered according to principles that were recorded and accepted. The division of realms was final: sky, sea, underworld. The earth was common, but it was largely left to its own devices. Mortals lived upon it, generation after generation, and their lives followed patterns that were, in their own way, as predictable as those of the gods. The children of gods and mortals, the demigods, became fewer. Their deeds, when they occurred, were smaller in scale. They fought local bandits. They founded small villages. Their names were recorded in local chronicles, but they did not travel across the known world. The blood of the gods, it was said, was diluted by successive mortal pairings. The spark of greatness grew dimmer, though it never entirely vanished. On Olympus, The routines of the gods were maintained. Assemblies were held. Nectar and ambrosia were consumed. Disputes arose and were settled, usually by Zeus's word. The disputes were often familiar. Hera might question a union. Poseidon might dispute a boundary. Apollo might claim a privilege. These discussions followed established protocols. Resolutions were reached. The balance was restored. The interactions with mortals became increasingly formal. Prayer was the primary method of communication. The gods listened, or were said to listen. They responded through signs, the flight of birds, the rustling of leaves in a sacred grove, the entrails of a sacrificed animal. These signs were interpreted by specialists. The interpretations were cautious and often ambiguous. Direct intervention was rare. A sudden calm at sea might be attributed to Poseidon's favor. A successful harvest might be thanked as Demeter's gift, but the god did not appear in person to claim credit. The heroes of old were worshipped as local powers. Shrines to Heracles were common. Offerings were left for Theseus. These practices were continuations of habit. The heroes themselves were long since gone, either having died or having been granted immortality and dwelling apart. Their stories were told at their shrines. The telling was part of the ritual. Time passed, and kingdoms rose and fell. The Mycenaeans gave way to others. Cities were built upon the ashes of older cities. In each new founding, the gods were invoked. Athena was asked to bless the Acropolis. Apollo was asked to sanctify the Agora. The rituals of foundation were copied from earlier models. The words were ancient. Their meaning was taken for granted. The myths explained origins. Why was there a strange rock formation on the coast? It was a stone thrown by a Titan during the war. Why did a particular spring never run dry? It was born from the hoof strike of Pegasus. These explanations were not tested. They were simply attached to the landscape. The landscape, in turn, validated the myths. The proof was in the presence of the rock, the existence of the spring. Poets continued to work, but their task shifted from creation to compilation. They gathered local stories and fit them into the larger framework. They smoothed out contradictions, or sometimes noted them without resolving them. A poet might say, "Some say that this event happened in this way, but others tell it differently." Both versions were then recorded. The existence of multiple versions did not undermine the myth. It simply demonstrated its age and its pervasive nature. Philosophical inquiry began to ask different questions. Instead of asking what Zeus did, philosophers asked what Zeus represented. The myths were treated as allegories. The battles of the gods represented clashes of natural forces, fire against water, air against earth. The passions of the gods represented human emotions magnified to a cosmic scale. This analytical approach did not replace the myths. It existed alongside them, a separate layer of commentary. The myths themselves remained unchanged by the analysis. The oracles, though fewer, still functioned. The most famous was at Delphi. Questions were submitted.
The Pythia, seated over a fissure, gave answers. The answers were often cryptic. Go by sea might mean literally to sail, or it might mean to take a fluid, adaptable approach. Beware the wooden wall might refer to ships or to a literal palisade. The ambiguity was intentional. It placed the burden of interpretation on the questioner. The authority of the oracle rested on this ambiguity and on its long history of being consulted. Festivals provided a rhythm to the year. The Panathenaea in Athens, the Olympic Games in Elis, the Theswaphoria for women. These events were held according to schedule. They involved processions, sacrifices, competitions, and feasts. The rituals performed were precisely defined. A mistake in the ritual was considered a bad omen, requiring repetition or atonement. The emphasis was on doing things exactly as they had been done before. Innovation was suspect. In this atmosphere of repetition and preservation, the mythic narrative reached a state of completion. All the major events had transpired. The cosmos had been ordered. The gods had established their domains. The heroes had performed their labors. The great war at Troy had been fought. The returns had been accomplished. What remained was the steady state of divine rule and mortal life. Thus, the stories ceased to develop. They became a fixed body of knowledge, a cultural possession. They were transmitted from one generation to the next as a set of references, a shared language for understanding the world. The power of the myths lay not in their novelty, but in their familiarity. A listener hearing the name Sisyphus immediately understood the concept of futile, endless labor. The story itself did not need to be retold in full. The name was enough. The gods, in their immortal stability, became symbols of these enduring concepts. Zeus was not just a sky god. He was the principle of ordained authority. Hera was not just a jealous wife. She was the force of social and marital continuity. Poseidon was the untamable chaos of the natural world. Hades was the inescapable reality of death. These symbolic understandings enriched the myths, but did not alter their plots. And so, as the centuries accumulated quietly, the vibrant, chaotic, action-filled age of origins receded further and further into a distant, golden-hued past. It became a time out of time, a foundational era that was qualitatively different from the present. The present was the age of repetition, of ritual, of maintenance. The past was the age of creation, of conflict, of definition. The narrative, therefore, arrives at a point where it can only look backward. It has no forward momentum, because within its own terms the story is over. The rule of Zeus is perpetual. The domains are set. The patterns are established. What happens now is merely the working out of those patterns in the lives of mortals, season after season, generation after generation. The myths in their entirety sit as a complete and closed loop. They begin with nothingness.
Remembrance persisted. It became its own form of existence. The myths were not merely recalled, they were inhabited as mental landscapes. A scholar, tracing a line of text, did not encounter a god,
but a reference to a god. The reference was stable. It pointed to the same attribute, the same story, the same epithet. This stability was comforting. It suggested that amidst the flux of human affairs, some things remained anchored. The physical remnants of the mythic age were treated with care. A supposed spearhead from the Trojan War was displayed. A stone said to have been rolled by Sisyphus was pointed out. These objects derived their importance not from their material, but from the story attached to them. The story was the true relic. The object was merely a focus. The language of the myths seeped into everyday speech. A difficult task was a Herculean labor. A perilous journey between two dangers was between Scylla and Charybdis. A source of endless trouble was a Pandora's box. These phrases were used without conscious thought of their origins. The myths had become idiom, their narrative essence distilled into shorthand for human experience. On Olympus, the gods, in their eternal present, continued their routines. The feasts were held. The hours, the horae, regulated the seasons. The graces provided adornment. The muses provided inspiration, though their inspiration now flowed to poets who wrote variations on old themes rather than new epics. The gods' attention, when it fell to earth, was fleeting and diffuse. A general might feel a surge of courage and attribute it to Ares. A sudden, clever idea might be thanked as a gift from Athena. These were private, unverifiable experiences. They did not alter the course of empires. The minor deities, the nymphs and river gods, fared less well as belief changed. A grove cut down for timber took its dryad with it, not in a death, but in a fading from attention. A river diverted for irrigation ceased to be seen as a personified god and became a watercourse. The numinous presence retreated from the world, not with a protest, but with a quiet diminishment. The world became more mechanical, and the spirits inherent in its parts were gradually explained away. The philosophers' allegories grew more complex. The entire theogony of Hesiod was interpreted as a physical treatise on the generation of the cosmos from primal elements. Chronos, time, devouring his children, was seen as the destructive nature of temporal passage. Zeus's eventual victory was the triumph of rational order over chaotic becoming. These interpretations were logical, neat, and entirely separate from the visceral imagery of the myths themselves. The two streams, the poetic and the philosophical, ran parallel, seldom meeting. The rituals, however, resisted allegory. The act of sacrifice was literal. The blood was real. The smoke rose in a specific way that was scrutinized for meaning. The taste of the ritual feast was tangible. The festival dances had precise steps. This physicality ensured the myth's survival in practice long after their narratives had ceased to evolve. People performed the rites because the rites were there to be performed. The why was buried under layers of tradition. The underworld, in all its detailed geography, became a subject for esoteric speculation rather than dread. Mystery cults like those at Eleusis promised initiates a favorable lot in the afterlife, a personal connection to the myth of Demeter and Persephone that transcended the common fate. These cults did not invent new myths so much as they personalized the existing ones, offering a participatory role in the sacred story. The myth remained fixed, the initiate's relationship to it changed. And so, the age of the gods transitioned into the age of their cult. Worship was no longer about interacting with capricious, present beings. It was about maintaining a relationship with distant, powerful principles through correct form. Piety became synonymous with ritual accuracy and traditional observance. Innovation was impiety. The heroes, now fully transformed into objects of cult, were local patrons. Their myths served as foundational charters for cities. The story of Theseus explained Athenian unity. The story of Heracles justified Dorian claims to the Peloponnese. The myths were tools of politics and identity, their malleability spent, their final forms serving static purposes. In this environment, the narrative truly could not progress. It was weighed down by its own success, its own completeness. Every question had an answer, every phenomenon an explanation, every social structure a divine precedent. The creative chaos that birthed the myths had been succeeded by an orderly, repetitive stillness. Thus, the chronicle enters its final phase, not of telling, but of cataloging, not of believing, but of studying, not of experiencing, but of referencing. The gods are now entries in a lexicon. The heroes are items on a list. The monsters are specimens in a bestiary of the imagination. The stories endure, but they are like pressed flowers in a heavy book, fragile, faded, their colors preserved, but their vitality gone. They are beautiful because they are old, meaningful because they have been repeated for so long, powerful because they have shaped the language and thought of those who keep them. And so, with no more events to record, no more conflicts to resolve, no more births of new gods or monsters, the history of Greek myth concludes. It does not end, it simply becomes what it has always been destined to be, a memory, perfectly preserved, endlessly available, and forever still.
In the final accounting, which is no accounting at all, but a sustained note held indefinitely, the myths achieved a state of perfect inertia. Motion ceased. The wheel of stories, having turned from chaos to order, settled into a position from which it would not move again. The energy required was no longer available.
or perhaps it was no longer required. The universe of the myth was complete, and a complete system requires no additional input. The gods themselves, in their distant halls, may have continued their existences, but those existences no longer generated narrative. They became pure function. Zeus upheld, Hera bound, Poseidon stirred, Hades received. Their personalities, once the source of so much drama, flattened into their domains. The jealousies, the passions, the whims, these were attributes locked in the stories of the past. In the eternal present of divinity, they were as static as the statues made in their likeness. The world of mortals moved on to other concerns. Laws were codified based on precedent, not divine pronouncement. History was recorded as the actions of men and women, not as the interplay between human and divine wills. The oracles fell silent, their fissures closed by earthquakes or neglect. The sacred groves were protected by law, but the protection was cultural, a recognition of heritage, not a fear of the nymph within. The poets of later ages looked back on the mythic period as a treasury of metaphor. A Roman poet might invoke Achilles' wrath not to tell the story anew, but to illustrate a point about his own patron's military prowess. The myth was a tool in a rhetorical kit, its edges worn smooth from use. Its power to shock or awe was diminished by familiarity. It was classic, which is to say, it was respected and largely inert. The scholarly tradition ossified around the texts. Alexandrian librarians catalogued variants. Commentators wrote line-by-line exegesis, debating whether a certain phrase was meant literally or figuratively. The myths became objects of analysis, their layers parsed like geological strata. This scholarly attention was a form of entombment. The stories were preserved under glass, labeled, and placed in orderly rows. Even the disruptions of later empires, conquests, the rise of new religions did not erase the myths. They transformed them again into curiosities. They became pagan stories, the charming but false beliefs of a bygone age. They were studied as philosophy's childhood or as moral fables. In this role, they were safe. A story identified as false is no longer a threat. It is a specimen. And so the great interconnected web of tales, from the void of chaos to the fall of Troy, from the brutality of the Titans to the intricate justice of Zeus, shrank into a curriculum. It was taught to school children who learned the names as they learned the alphabet, a necessary foundation for understanding art, literature, and the roots of their own language. The profound strangeness of it all, the swallowing of children, the patricide, the metamorphoses, the relentless cycle of vengeance was softened by distance and routine. The monsters finally were tamed. The Minotaur became a symbol of the inner labyrinth. The Hydra represented a problem that grows when attacked. The Sphinx was a riddle to be solved by intellect. They were neutered by interpretation, their physical terror sublimated into intellectual exercise. In this state, the narrative reaches its ultimate quietistic form. It is not a story being told, but a story that has been told. Its existence is post-narrative. It sits on the shelf. It is recalled in fragments.
A thunderstorm might prompt a half-remembered line about Zeus the cloud-gatherer. A difficult journey might bring to mind the trials of Odysseus, but these are echoes, growing fainter with each repetition. The chronicle, therefore, has nothing left to chronicle. It has followed the thread from non-existence to existence, from raw power to established institution, from vibrant chaos to sterile order. The end point of this process is not an event, but a condition, the condition of being historical, of being over. Thus, we arrive at the silence after the telling. The myths have not vanished. They are present in the way a mountain is present, as a fact of the landscape, largely ignored, occasionally glanced at, fundamentally unchanging. They do not speak unless we speak for them. They do not act unless we animate them with our attention. And in this long, unbroken silence, the work is done. The gods are fixed in their heavens. The heroes are ash in their urns. The monsters are bones in the bedrock. The stories are words on a page. All is as it was and as it will be, for there is no force left to change it. This is the end of the history, which is not an ending, but a permanent suspension. The tale is told. The teller ceases. The listener may depart. Nothing more follows.